Hello everyone, and welcome back to more Hearts of Iron 3. Now in the previous video, we had a look at some game purchase details, we had a look at basic unit types, hierarchies, and some very basic unit maneuver. This time around, we're going to look more at unit maneuver, although it's going to be more advanced. We're going to look at advanced unit types, and we're also going to start looking at resource management. Now if you guys are looking for a complete Hearts of Iron-ish tutorial, I do have one of those up on my channel. I'll put a link to it so you can click on it on the screen or whatever. There's bullet-in points made throughout the video, so use those so you guys won't sit there for the full fucking hour. With that out of the way, let's just jump right into it and learn more about Hearts of Iron 3. So in the first video, we had a look at some very basic unit maneuver. We showed you guys, or I showed you guys, how to move around, how to move units, how to strategically reorganize or redeploy, and just some basic stuff. And realistically, that's all you're going to need to know. But I do want to add some more details about naval invasions and stuff like that, because it will most likely be quite important to you. First thing being, to do a naval invasion in Hearts of Iron 3, you need transport ships, and you need ports to do the fucking invasion from. Transport ships are quite basic. I think every country with ports will actually, by standard, have the transport ship researched. If not, you'll probably have to go and research it. All you'll need to do then is really just have a unit with a low enough weight to be put onto that transport ship, or have multiple transport ships. In our case here, this unit has a weight of 30, and our ship, let me just get the ship, can carry 40 weight. So that means that our unit can clearly fit onto the ship. All I'll need to do to put it on the ship is just really click this green button here, and it will be loaded onto the ship. It'll sort of disappear and it'll be on the ship. If I want to do transports, if I just want to transport a unit from one port to another, all I'll have to do is right click and choose transport, and let's take a look at what that looks like. You can tell it just went over, it dropped our unit off, and it went straight back. If you are invading enemy territory, however, there's a couple of things that you have to notice. The first thing being, regular infantry divisions have extremely high attrition when invading navally, especially if there is an enemy unit there. So let's imagine, or I'll put an image here. Let's imagine that there's an infantry unit in St. George, and I'm using my regular infantry unit here to do a naval invasion straight to the region where they are. My unit will be absolutely obliterated. To combat that, you'll have to produce Marines, or you'll just have to land your unit where there's no enemy. So let me just show you what that would look like. So in Hearts of Iron 3, when you do naval invasions, all you'll have to do is just have the fucking ship in a port, click on it, and right click on the province where you want to go. And there you go. That's really it. There's not much more to it, which is one of the reasons why I love Hearts of Iron 3. In Hearts of Iron 4, you need fucking naval superiority and all that bullshit. Now, as a side note, this works pretty much the exact same way for doing air invasions, but you will need paratroopers. Regular infantry divisions cannot load, or they cannot do like paradrops. But I think you can transport units on planes, but you can't do like proper paradrop attacks. But the same thing applies. You'll need to have the correct amount of weight and all that good stuff. So in the last video, we had a look at some very basic unit types, but this time around, we're going to go a little bit more into detail, and I'm going to try and explain the basic units of the game. Hearts of Iron 3 does have a lot of units, and explaining them all would take a very long time, so the easiest way to do it is to sort of oversimplify it, but still make it so that you guys understand. So in the last video, we had a look at some basic infantry, and we also looked at headquarters. Just to recap, infantry units, they're just regular walking soldiers. They have some support equipment, like these guys have some light artillery. Those are going to be mortars. And they do have some anti-tank weapons. HQs is your military staff. They're like your leaders, essentially. They don't have any attack or any defense. If you try and put these units into combat, they will just retreat. They can attack along with units if you want to, but personally I just find them to be sort of in the way, so realistically what I end up doing is just sort of like leaving them behind, at least like one region behind where the front line is. I find that to be most effective. But anyway, in this video we're having a look at some other type of units. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Garrison, the Militia, the Light Tank, the Mountain Infantry, and the Military Police. So I think that the most important unit to talk about is the Garrison. And what is a Garrison, you might ask? Well, a Garrison is basically an infantry unit, but it is extremely, extremely slow. Like, it moves slowly. It moves at barely a kilometer per hour. Usually they'll move at max 1 kilometer per hour, but since there's mountains right here, they move even slower. They have pretty good stats. They almost have the same stats as regular infantry, but they're extremely slow, but they are fast training. So for me personally, what I use garrisons for is to protect certain regions or certain cities as a static form of defense. So for example, I'll have my own garrison unit for my capital city. I'll have one for my ports and stuff like that. And since they're so easy to train, it's really easy to just make a bunch of them and place them around. Or you can also use them for like a secondary defensive line. So let's imagine that I have my primary offensive line here, and I'll keep garrison units behind that in case I end up retreating, so my enemy can't counterattack me while I'm retreating and stuff like that. And as far as I can remember, I also told you guys a little bit about support units, but let's start talking about those before we get on with the regular unit types. Now, when you make a division, and this is a division, your division, like I mentioned, they have some support stuff like light artillery, mortars, stuff like that, but you will need to add support brigades like artillery or military police. Military police is useful mostly for suppression, like you do have a certain revolt risk. If you end up conquering non-core states, you will have a revolt risk. So military police are very useful, for example, to combine with cavalry because they're both quite fast. But for a regular infantry division, what you will need is engineers, artillery. Okay, let's just take a look at the different supports. Yeah, armored cars, anti-aircraft in some cases, anti-tank, all of these kinds of support units, and there's a bunch more you can add as well, which will all give your units certain kinds of stats. Like artillery obviously have very high soft attack, so it's very effective against infantry if you're going to be fighting against infantry. If you know your enemy has a lot of tanks, you might add extra anti-tank artillery guns. If your enemy has a lot of airplanes, you'll add anti-aircraft, whatever floats your boat. But like I mentioned, it's just important to state the fact that you do need those support regiments. Like an infantry unit can fight on its own just fine, but it's really optimal to have at least a support regiment per division. Another thing I also wanted to talk about is the amount of units per division. Later in the game, you'll be able to add up to 6 brigades per division. You can see right now my limit is 4. I cannot add more than 4. So later in the game, you might have 3 primary brigades, and then you can have 2 support brigades as well, which is quite useful. But stick to the standard of having 3 primary divisions or like brigades, and then having 1 support. Don't do 2 supports or full infantry. That's not going to be very useful for you, at least in my experience. Everyone has an opinion, I guess, but I would highly recommend that that's the way you use it, or that's the way you make it. So we've talked about the garrison, we've talked about the military police, and let's get talking about militia. Now, personally, I don't find militia to be that useful, but militia is essentially a fast unit with really good stats for defending, for example, like right here on forests or woods or whatever. But they're not very useful for your frontline attacks or anything like that. Like they're good for emergency uses because these units are so fast to train. Let's see. Yeah, it takes around 70 days to create a full division of militia. So these are very fast units to create. but personally I don't find them to be that useful. I personally just use garrisons. But if I'm in a really bad spot, for example, if I have a lot of revolts or something along those lines, maybe you would end up using them, or you could use them as like a secondary offensive line, like I talked about with the garrisons. Or if you're going for a army structure where you have a lot of units, and you go for like just having a whole bunch of these, they might also be useful. Realistically, I don't know how useful they're going to be to you, but they're there. They're a thing. Anyway, let's move on. Mountain units is one of the most popular, I guess I would say, or maybe like it's one of the most used unit in Hearts of Iron 3. You're going to see mountain units all the time, especially if you're like over in Northern Europe or you're down here in the South, whatever. They're going to be everywhere. They're units that have very low attrition in mountains. They have pretty much the same stats as infantry. They move faster in mountains, obviously. They have better defense in mountains. And they're really useful if you have mountainous provinces. Your units won't be as slow. They won't have as high attrition. You won't get out of supply and stuff like that as easily. So, for example, in my case, you can tell, I'll put on a terrain map. These gray regions, these are very mountainous regions. So in my case, it is kind of handy to have mountain infantry. But if you have a country where everything is flat, or you're not invading anyone who has a lot of mountains, I would probably maybe avoid them because, like I mentioned, their stats are a bit poorer than infantry. Let's actually pull up the stats right here. I haven't actually studied these. So yeah, the mountain morale is a little bit higher. They have pretty much the same weight. Actually, the infantry is a bit heavier. Yeah, you can really tell their stats are pretty high for mountainous attacks and stuff like that. So that is where they're most useful. I guess it sort of speaks for itself. The next unit type we're going to look at is a primary type unit like the mountain infantry and the garrison. It's the armor division. In this case, it's the light armor division because it's the only technology Romania has when the game starts out. Now, armor is obviously tanks. These are units that are hard, which means that, for example, infantry without any support have quite low effect on tanks. And they're also really good to combine with, for example, mechanized or motorized divisions. And armor is going to be a core element of your army. Since armor, like I mentioned, is effective, quite effective against soft targets, not as effective as infantry, believe it or not. Armor is also best combined with a kind of other. I wouldn't call armor a support unit. I definitely wouldn't do that. But I will say that if you want to have an effective army, definitely go ahead and combine your armor brigades with infantry, because on their own they're just not that good. These stats are pretty bad. So go ahead and combine armor with engineers. That's also going to be really good. Engineers build bridges and stuff like that in military settings. And when you can later on, also go ahead and go for mechanized and motorized infantry. That's going to make you utilize the speed of a light tank unit quite good. Light tanks are fast. They obviously have lower soft attack and lower hard attack than medium and heavy tanks, but in return, like I mentioned, these are quite fast. So they're going to be an important part in your army. So those are some of the basic unit types. There's a lot more unit types in Hearts of Iron 3. I sort of have to mention these special units. If you bought the full version of Hearts of Iron 3, which I really hope you did, you'll see that some countries have these kind of units with stars in them. Some are they have special units, essentially. The big powers in Hearts of Iron 3 have special units. That's what I'm trying to hammer home here. For example, these are the Red Guards, I believe they're called. They have certain stats, and you're going to need to look at all that stuff up by yourself. Take a look at what kind of stats the special unit has. The Soviets have the Red Guards. The Italians have some kind of mountain brigade, I think. Germany has the SS, as far as I can remember. And the US, I believe, have the Green Berets. Not 100% sure. At least they have a special unit as well. So that's pretty much everything that I actually wanted to say about unit types. Now you're going to want to research and look stuff up on Hearts of Iron Wiki or whatever to learn more about this, because this isn't a complete in-depth tutorial about every single stat and every single kind of thing about these units. This is just a general explanation of what unit types are and how best to combine them. I haven't mentioned air wings or flotillas that much because I personally believe that in Hearts of Iron 3, they're not that useful. Especially if you're playing as a smaller power, but moving navies around is pretty simple. You just order them to certain locations. You can also put them on missions like convoy raiding. If I'm at war with the Soviet Union, it might be effective for me to do convoy raiding right here. They'll sink Soviet supply convoys and so forth. But it's all pretty basic stuff. Like, you'll find this out just by right-clicking with your navy. But the thing I want to talk about now is resource management. A very, very important thing in Hearts of Iron 3, as you obviously are Grand Duke, Reichsfuhrer, whatever, President, Prime Minister. You are everything in your country. And part of being that is managing your resources. So for managing resources, the most important tab, or the most useful tab in my opinion, would be the Diplomacy tab. This is where you do trading with other countries. Like if you're lacking a resource, let's say in my case I actually have a good amount of resources. I'm not losing anything. The numbers would be red if I was. But let's say I wanted to buy energy. The most effective thing is to sort this list by who has the most energy. In this case, it's the United States. And I'll just click Offer Trade Agreement, and I can buy a certain amount of energy. In this case, I have plus 16 every day. But let's say I'm losing 5. I'll want to buy maybe 6, and then see if they'll accept it. This little box right here is an indication towards how they will respond. So, like, if it says impossible, don't waste your diplomatic points. I've never ever seen an AI actually accept something when it says impossible here. Rarely even with likely. If it says likely, I'm trying to make it say likely here. It just is impossible to everything other than energy. Yeah. Even if it says likely, the most likely decline it. The only certain answer here, if it says very likely, they will do it. In Hearts of Iron 3 by standard, if you play on normal mode, the AI is very forgiving, I would say. They'll just spam you with trade agreements until you are in the green. You won't have to do anything, which really is a shame. It's sort of bad. But if you play on a harder difficulty, you're definitely going to notice how resource management plays a part. Right here, you already see we got a trade agreement because we have a very low... what would it be like? We have a very low amount of money, or like we have a very low... Deficit is when it goes down, and I can't remember the word. Whatever. We have a very low amount of money that actually goes in. Like, so if we sell more supplies, the AI can tell we have a lot of supplies. So fucking, what is this? New Zealand or Australia is asking us to sell supplies, and that's basically going to save our economy here. Yeah. So the AI is very, very forgiving. Most likely they'll just spam you until you have enough agreements. Or if you create if you make an excess of supplies like I'm doing right now, they'll most likely do that as well. So realistically, you're not going to struggle with resources. But if you end up struggling for resources in case you're at war with everyone or something like that, capturing certain resources will be very useful. So sorting the map by the resources might be a very useful tool for you. Romania does actually have quite a bit of oil. The Romanian oil fields are notorious. Or where the fuck are they? Well, we're supposed to have oil historically, but I guess we don't. Oh, Hungary has some oil. Hungary has oil, but Romania doesn't. What? I thought Romania had some oil. The more you know, Romania doesn't have any oil in Hearts of Iron 3, but whatever. If you're Germany and you definitely need oil, you can tell which regions have certain strategic resources. So Altenburg has aluminium. This region has automotive industry. This region has helium, and so forth and so forth. And these resources will be quite useful to you. Norway has heavy water. Sweden has, what is this? Tungsten and metals. Stuff like that. However, these traded resources aren't the only kind of resource that you have. Far from it. You also have manpower. Probably pretty obvious, but manpower is what you use to create and maintain your armies. And the higher core population you have, the more armies you will be able to create. Manpower is also affected by what kind of laws you have in your country. So if you have very strict conscription laws, for example, I have the 1-year draft, I'll get more manpower the stricter conscription laws I have. You use manpower also for reinforcements. You can tell that right now I'm not using enough of my industrial capacity on resources or on reinforcements, sorry. But you can tell our army definitely has a need for resources. Diplomatic influence and espionage points are assigned through the technologies tab. I'll go more through the technologies tab later on, but you use these sliders to adjust how much leadership you want to spend on these different things. In this case, I'm just pouring everything into officers because I made a bunch of units and now we have a lack of officers. A officer percentage higher than I believe it is 96 is acceptable, but it's going to be best if you have more than 100. If you want to get more leadership points, you're going to want to research education, just as a side note, and we'll go more into this technology tab later on in the video. Now, it isn't really a resource, but national unity is also extremely important to how you run your country and how things are when you go to war. National unity is essentially how many of your victory points your enemy will need to take before your country surrenders. So in my case, if the enemy takes Bucharest and Ploiesti, I will most likely surrender my entire country. And you can affect the national unity by assigning more spies, for example, to raising the national unity. There's also a bunch of events that you can do to essentially change your national unity for the good and for the worst. Assigning certain politicians might do the trick for you. And there's a bunch of things, a bunch of events that you can do to make sure that you have a higher national unity. As a quick note as well, in the first video, I don't think I explained movement arrows too much. All I really wanted to add was that if you're being attacked and you lose a battle and the arrow turns white, it means that you're retreating. If you get certain bars on the side of your division counter, if it's yellow, they're poorly organized. If it's red, they're in poor supply. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's really all I had for this tutorial. Next up, we're going to take a look at victory points, map modes, trading, more in-depth trading, and diplomacy. If you guys enjoyed this kind of video, I do have a Twitch where I sometimes stream. It's been a little while since the last video, or since the last stream rather, because I'm sort of busy with the university and all kinds of shit. I also have a fucking Twitter, which I haven't used since 2013. But if you want to check that out, that's also going to be, I guess, on the channel page, something. That's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.